So let's see what the salt did. It has some interesting texture where the salt sucked up some of the color and the water and then redistributed it. The first thing that you want to do is just to gently rub off the sand or the salt. And you have to make sure to do this when it's completely dry. You don't want the paper to be broken down so that it is tearing or ripping in any way. A lot of that salt's going to come off pretty easily, but the ones that are a little bit stuck, if you just take the edge of your fingernail and gently get that off. Again, just be real careful so that you don't break down the paper. Okay. So that has an interesting texture, and it even did this cool thing where it concentrates most of the dark into the middle. Look at that. That's what happens. So one of the interesting things about this project is that we're working from dark to light, and that's really unusual with watercolor. Because watercolors are semi-transparent, usually you start with light colors and then you build on top of those and you finally get to your darks. Because we're doing this different approach, we're going to be using white, because white is not as semi-transparent as the other colors in watercolor. There's a little bit of opacity, and that's going to help us to achieve something kind of like this. This was my rough practice. Give it that sense of light against dark. So we're going to be using an unusual tool. We're going to be using a toothpick. You'll also need your white and water. And let's see how I can do this. I'm going to do it like that. Okay. So I'm going to wet the white watercolor. I'm just using a brush for this. And then I'm going to use the pointy end of my toothpick, and I'm actually scratching in order to do a couple of things. I'm going to be building up some of the white on my toothpick. Before I get too far along, I'm going to plan out where my wildflower is and the size of it. And I'm going to use the lid of my watercolors in order to give myself a nice round circle. Since most of my watercolor was concentrated here in the center, that's going to be my highest area of contrast once I get the white on there. So I think I'm going to position my lid on top of that, and I'm going to use my white in order to give myself a traced circle, but I'm not actually going to trace it with a line. I'm going to trace it with dots. So I'm just taking my white and I'm laying down a series of dots, and they're not going to be going all the way. They're not going to complete a full circle. They're going to complete maybe 2/3 of a circle. If I lift this up, then I can see where my little dots are. I might have to make those a little darker. Okay, so I'm intentionally not bringing them all the way down. I do want to find the center, and so if I put this back on carefully, I can see my center is going to be right here. Lift it out, go straight down. Is that pretty close? Let's take a peek. That looks pretty good. So this center is going to be really important, And again, I'm going to add some water. And now the fun part. I'm going to be scratching. This is just going to take a lot of patience. This is my center, and I'm going to go ahead and scratch out for my center. Toward the perimeter, but not past it. And then I'm going to start my dragging from the inside or the outside toward my center. So each of these little dots is going to be coming toward the center. Oopsie. If it helps for you, get more water so that it's a little bit easier to scratch. If it's easier for you to turn your paper, please feel free to do so. Oh my gosh, that makes scratching in toward the center so much easier. Okay, so our wildflower doesn't only have like a fan of these little pod things, but it's three-dimensional, right? So we're going to make more of these scratches coming in toward the center, about a finger width away from the outside. It's going to start making it look three-dimensional. And you can decide how many of these little pod scratches you have. I'm going to rotate this around because I found that was a lot easier. And I don't know if you noticed, but I'm laying my toothpick kind of at a low angle. That's also making it easier. And each time that I scratch in, then I'm rotating it so that the paint that's at the end gets picked up on the paper. And then I'm going to come in about another finger width and do another series of scratches toward the center. So keeping in mind that you're trying to make this sense of a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional piece of paper is helpful, because whereas each of these parts of the flowers, when it rotates toward the viewer, then it appears to be shorter, even though in truth it's just as long as the ones that are in that fan shape that are standing upright related to the viewer. Now you might decide that the ends of these little wildflower pieces have little little shapes to them. And so we're going to give this, just change it from being a simple shape, which is a line, to something that looks a little bit more like the tip of that wildflower. I always think it's kind of neat to paint with white. It's a little unexpected because so much of art is done on white paper. So if you start with a colored paper and then you add white, I think it's a little bit of a surprise. I also really love the idea of using atypical instruments in order to make a painting. Brushes are fabulous, but in this case, this toothpick gives us these scratches that work so much more effectively. So we're going to build up the white. Give myself a little bit more water. And my white watercolor. And we're going to build up an irregular shape that's in the center. Okay, so we're actually going to put a base down for the flower stem, and I'm going to be using white in order to build up the first layer of it, let it dry, and then I'll put some green on top. So we're going to be using a small round brush and dip it into your white and just give it some slight curve. We can also give ourselves some leaves. And again, I'm going to do it in white first, and then I'll be adding another layer of green on it. And at this point, if this is a wildflower or if it's a dandelion, then all of these little seeds are getting ready to fall off, and the leaves, which were a little bit thicker and livelier, they've kind of like started to droop and dry. And so I'm making some leaves that are just kind of falling down just to either side. And the way that you get this shape to thin at the end is to use just the tip of your brush. This is actually not a great brush because it's pretty thick at the end. If you have a watercolor brush that comes to a point, in fact, look at this. This is a better point than this one. I bet I could even use a thicker brush, but just use the very tip of it to come to a point even better than my smaller brush that doesn't come to a point. I'm going to try that. But remember, the secret is I don't want to use the whole brush, just the very, very tip. So you press down and then you lift up and use the shape of your brush to help you to create the shape of these leaves. And this one's going to cross over too. I'm just giving myself shapes. So you can decide which size brush you think works best. In general, big shapes need big brushes. Small shapes, you want to use small brushes. But do keep in mind that the shape of the brush is sometimes as important as the size of the brush. So I really like some of these, what we call negative spaces. Yours might turn out a little bit different, but having these pockets of space between the stem and the leaves is visually going to help someone see the shape of this and realize what it is. So I have 4 leaves. You could have more than that or less, that's fine too. And I'm going to let this white dry, maybe adjust the thickness just a little bit. And come back to, oops. Come back to my flower. Make sure that there's a little bit of a puddle of water on top of my white so that I can still get to it. Just for the romantic aspect of it, we are going to add one of these seeds that is floating off of our dandelion, and up here just getting ready to fly away. So and it has a little end. Maybe there's 2 of them. I like that this one's a little shorter than this one because it makes it feel like it's angled away from the viewer just a little bit. Well, I like that. Okay, we're going to develop some of the darks that are in with our lights, so and our stem. So let's go ahead and get our blues and our greens and our yellows ready for us. The stem should be pretty dry now, and it's always good to dry off or clean off your watercolors before you start to use them. Clearly, if this is a yellow and I want it to be a straight yellow, then I'd need to wipe off the excess paint. The way that you can do that is just to wet the top of your color and then wipe it off. As it is, this is the second time that I've done this painting, and so I've already got some green into my yellow, which actually is going to be okay because I'm going to be blending green with yellow. So you can use your tray as a mixing tray. You can just bring over some of your green, bring over some of your yellow until you mix a color that you're happy with. Sometimes, because I'm a messy painter, I mix directly onto my color cakes and then I wipe it off afterwards. It's really up to you. So now I'm going to go over that white with this lime green. Like so. because the white is underneath it, it really, that lime green doesn't have to do all that much work in order to separate itself from the dark background. Now I might want to get just a little bit of a gradient. So I'm going to take some of my pure green. I like the color that's right across from the yellow, and pick and choose a couple of places to put it in so that it seems like there's kind of a dark, medium, and light area to the stem and to the leaves. Using the values of a color, dark, medium, and light, is always a nice way of giving a little bit of depth and interest. So I'm trying to make like the right side of my stem more yellow and the left side of my stem more green, and that's going to give it some interesting variation. One of the beautiful things about watercolor. Okay, now I can tell that I'm starting to overdo it just a little bit, so I'm going to stop, stand back, and focus on the rest of the flower. So I want to give a little bit of shape and dimension to where the seeds come together in the body of the flower. And so I'm going to pick up some of my blue. In this case, it's going to be, I think I'm going to try maybe the darkest blue, which is the one that's next to the red. And just drop in. Now I'm definitely not trying to paint over the whole thing. I'm just trying to create a high contrast center. So a couple of little dots here and there, and right where my flower meets my stem, I'm going to bring in some of this very dark blue. Maybe just a couple of dots there. I still want this to be mostly white. And if you want in watercolor, if you want something to be darker, then you pick a darker color, but then you have more color, less water. And if you want it to be lighter, then you do more water. Okay, now I'm going to add just a little bit of ink in order to really increase the contrast around my key parts. So since the center is pretty wet still, I'm going to ignore the center and ignore the stem. I'm going to come back to that. But using my thin Sharpie for the areas that are dry, I'm going to basically not outline the whole thing, but just outline pieces and parts on the side that's closest to the bottom of my page. So I'm going really slow. I'm going to go around this white. And it's kind of like putting a shadow line on the bottom of these seeds. in some cases it's not a strong line, it's just a little bit of maybe even a dashed line. And I'm going super slow so that I just hit whatever is the side that's closest to the bottom of my painting. And I'm trying to go straight on these seeds, so I might have to clear my area a little bit so that I can rotate my page, keeping track of where my bottom is. Now, if you find that your seeds have not dried quite as quickly as mine, you'll definitely want to wait, because if you put wet watercolor up against your Sharpie, it's going to stick to your Sharpie and then you won't be able to use your Sharpie. Had a couple of art teachers that have said color is less important than value. Since value is all about lights and darks, then you can get away with doing all kinds of different things with colors that may or may not be realistic, but values, how you treat values, is super important. Okay, now I think if I'm very careful, I might be able to use my ink pen and do a little shadow line on some of my stem. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to pick the side that is the darker side. So if I have a more yellow, limey side and then a darker side, that's where I'm going to put my shadow line. And then whatever sides are closer to the bottom, for my leaves. I love this, and I think it looks really great, but I feel like this stem might be a little bit lonely, so I think I might make some more leaves down here. I'm going to use this brush because, actually, I'm going to use this brush. It comes to a nice point. It's not too big, it's not too small. And picking up my white. Press down. Oops. So I'm making this grass or leaves by using the shape of my brush. So the brush comes to a tip, so I'm keeping that in mind. I point the brush to where the angle and the direction of my leaves, where I want it to be, and then I press down. And the more that I press down, the fatter my grass shape is. So it might help to move your painting. Ooh, look, I can kind of fix this funny little drip by making it part of the grass. I like having some of these cross over in front of each other. Having a variety of heights is interesting visually. Having some that cross behind your dandelion. It was interesting visually. And keep in mind, space these so that you have some of this negative space in between, right? That's so important so that it doesn't look like just a big old blob. At the same time, you want them to be close enough that they read like a group so that it doesn't just look like individual pieces. So it's a little bit tricky, and you can use not only the shapes of your leaves, but in this case where I have too many of them that are kind of like just making a blob, then you can add value. So I'm adding more white so that it stands out a bit. This one too, separating it from its neighbor a little bit. This one too, separating it from its neighbor a little bit, so that you have a variation of values and interesting shapes, interesting heights, a little bit of crisscross. And I'm going to connect these all at the bottom. So that they read like a unit, but then that they separate and have negative space a little higher up. I'm also going to come in and make my seed the middle of my wildflower a little bit bigger. And I'm going to add just a little bit of blue in here. It's a lighter blue. It's lighter just because I have more water in it. And then let that kind of streak down into my dark blue. See if I can keep it from turning into a little bit of a mess. I really like the light, medium, and dark, so this gives me the light of the white of the seeds, and then this light blue, and then this darker blue, and then the black in the background. All right. Now, I'm trying to decide if I want to add green to my grass or if I want to just leave it white. I'm going to let you decide, but I'm going to go ahead and make it green. So it's already, because it was pretty thin, it's already drying. I'm going to pick up my green and yellow. I'm using the green that's right across from the yellow. It gives it that lovely limey color. And going over my white. Try to go slow enough so that you go right on top of that white. I'm just going to go over the whole, all of my grasses with this lime color. And then I'm going to come back in with just the green, and from the bottom up, I'm going to put in just a little bit of the darker green. I might even use the green next to it. It seems like it might be a little bit darker. So starting from the bottom up, I was kind of trying to find a darker green. There we go. Well, I'm not sure I like how blue that green is though. And I'm trying to be thoughtful about where I put it so that I maintain some of my light, mediums, and darks. And if I've lost any of my middle or any of my lights, then I can come in with yellow and drop in some more yellow. It's one of the wonderful things about watercolor. As long as the shapes that you're working with are still wet, then they will self-blend. And I might even want to bring in some blues, because it's always a good idea to tie in colors in different locations. So since I have some blues up here, I'm going to come in with my dark blue. And give myself some darks. So I'm trying to position the darks so that they are part of each of these like strands of grass. So that like this strand of grass maybe has light, medium, and dark in it. I'm going to also use it to separate two areas of like two pieces of grass that are merging together. Or to make it look like a shadow. just do all kinds of things. So, for instance, here's a leaf that is blending into my stem. And the way that I can separate them is by adding this dark blue to the edge of my leaf, and then just like leaving it like that so that it appears to be kind of like a shadow of the stem onto that leaf. So you can kind of play with yours. Since your leaves are going to look different from mine, then you can kind of play with them using the watercolors to kind of separate. Here again, in order to let that stem read as a separate thing, then I've pushed that blue right up next to the stem. And this is a little bit of a mess in here. In this case, I just want for the leaf to look like it has two edges, a light edge and a dark edge. Here's two that are blending together, so I'd be able to separate them. Here's two that are blending together, so I can use my blue to separate them. Okay, so the final touch is, once all of the paint is completely dry, is to take a Sharpie and just create that one side oops. And in some cases, I don't know, I might decide that I need to have two sides. Outline. The Sharpie can also help you to separate shapes. Trying to apply it in a way that makes it look not too cartoony, although cartoons are kind of cool too, so you can kind of decide what works for you and your piece of art. But like here where I have two leaves that are kind of blending together, and that line can kind of do a lot to help separate them. A lot of art isn't necessarily knowing what you're going to do, but finding a way as you develop the piece. So that seems to do just enough separation without outlining everything. I'm going to come back up here, and in the areas where I lost a little bit of my shapes, I'm going to use my ink pen to redefine them just a little bit. When you get to a point that you're happy with it, you can sign it and call it good. Great job, guys.